workshop, Dare to Be Different. This is the first time I've ever recorded this kind of a video. We'll have to see how the editing goes. There are a couple of videos that I will try to embed, and since I'm not sure how that works, I'm also going to announce when I would like you to look them up and what they are, just in case I can't get them to embed later. The title of this workshop is Dare to Be Different, and the reason we offer this workshop as part of the Sant program is because you are spending every day, every place you are, with people who are different from you, and learning how to be intelligent, cooperative, curious, engaged with people who are different from you makes you a better person, makes you a better colleague, a better student. And so we're going to spend some time today looking at the complexity of identity. We're going to use a model called the model of multiple dimensions of identity. We're going to talk a little bit about stereotype and microaggression, and we'll return again to this, why this is important, why you need to learn this stuff. So I'm going to start. I would like for you to look up a John Green video called What Does It Mean to Be Human? I'm going to try to embed that, but if it doesn't show up in a minute or a few seconds, go ahead and find that video. And then we're going to look at the complexity of identity. So I hope that worked. I've cheated a little bit. I've drawn on this because I'm notoriously awful at drawing this freehand. But I want to start talking about the complexity of identity. The first thing I would like for you to do is get out a piece of paper and write down your very first thoughts when I describe people. If I get really clever in a few minutes, I will try to add some pictures to these descriptions so that you can actually see the people I'm describing. So the first thing I would like you to do is write down the very first word or phrase that comes to mind when I make these descriptions to you. You won't have to share them with anybody, but I would like for you to examine your very first thoughts when you hear these descriptions. So the first description is a young woman wearing a hijab and a niqab, which is the veil that covers all but the eyes. What are your first thoughts when you hear that person described? The second person is a young black man, about 22 years old, wearing blue jeans and a gray hoodie. What are your very first thoughts when you hear that description? The third description is an executive, an older white man wearing a suit and a tie, carrying a briefcase. What are your first thoughts when you hear that description? And finally, the very first thoughts when you hear this description, a young Latina woman who is quite pregnant. I chose those images pretty deliberately because they are often associated with some stereotypes in our culture, and I would like for you to be aware of how you think about those kinds of stereotypes when you first hear them. Sometimes we think without processing what we're thinking, and it makes us react in ways that are sometimes inappropriate. So starting to think about how we look at the complexity of other people's identity will also help us as we try to explore our own. So I want to share something called the model of multiple dimensions of identity. This was first put forth by Susan Jones and Eliza Abus, and I have forgotten the date. It was, I think, 2001. I'll try to add a citation for this. But I'm going to start with the very center of their diagram. This is the core. So if you were describing your own identity, you would start with this. You can see on this piece of paper I have drawn a small circle that's colored in. The core is how we understand ourselves, our values, our ideas, our traditions, the way we interact with people, the way we want people to understand us. So the core of who we are might not be something that people can see or identify in us, but is rather something that that we want people to see, things that we know about ourselves that we might want to show to other people. So, for instance, I would like to be seen as a compassionate person and a kind person. And although you wouldn't recognize that in me the first time you saw me, hopefully the way I identify myself and the way I share myself with the world would have something to do with kindness and compassion. Also, all of my traditions, my values, those are the things that are at my core. The second part of this model has to do with more visible or outward parts of our identity. So we have the core, but then we also have these parts of our identity that are like an ellipsis that go around. I hope that's visible. So there are 6 on this diagram, and I'm going to draw each of them in a different color. One of them is race. One of them is gender. One of them is class. One of them is religion. One of them is sexual orientation. And finally, one of them is ability or disability. So you can see now I have on my drawing 6 ellipses that demonstrate different parts of my identity. These, again, are things that are more visible or more known to people. Not all of them are visible all the time. Now, going back to that center, that place of my core, if you think of these as an ellipsis with something that orbits, I might place how I think about these different parts of my identity at different places depending on where I am. I'm going to plot some of my own sense of who I am based on sort of what is normal rather than what is happening right now. But if I'm out in the world, these are the places that I might plot my own identity experience. So if the first one is race, and I will label this one as race. It's turned around, so it does show up as race. See, I'm going to put that way out here because it's not something I ever have to think about. The fact that I'm a white woman means that I don't have to think about my race unless I want to. I think about my race when I'm doing anti-racist work, but I don't have to think about it at all. That's something we call privilege. It doesn't mean I'm better than somebody else. It doesn't mean I'm a brat. It just means that I have the privilege of not having to think about that part of my identity unless I really want to. I always define privilege as the things we don't have to think about. So when we're talking about race privilege, and I plot it over here, it's far away from my core because it's something that I don't have to think about. Now, if the second, I have to figure out which color I used where. If the second ellipses here is gender, sometimes this is much more salient for me, which means how important it is at particular moments. So my gender is much more salient to me in most places, most everyday occasions, than my race is. It's still not something I have to defend all the time, but I am going to plot this part of my identity. See if I'm getting this right. Yes, I'm going to plot this part of my identity a little closer to my core. I have been taught the myth that if I want to walk from my office in the Mike Cell house to the point, and it's after dark, that I should be nervous because women are taught from a young age that, for good reason, that we're at risk for sexual assault or violent crime. I know that when I negotiate a salary, I'm not as good at negotiating because I've been taught by the culture that that's something I shouldn't do, that I should just accept whatever is offered to me. So I know that I'm paid less often than male counterparts who are either better at negotiating a salary or are just given bigger salaries because of their gender. On the other hand, as I plot gender close to my core, I also am mindful that I'm cisgender. Cisgender may be a term you're unfamiliar with. Cisgender just means that my gender identity matches the biological sex I was assigned at birth. That makes things much, much easier for me than it does for a trans woman or for somebody who is non-binary. So while I put gender sort of in the middle, I'm also aware that there are ways that my gender is a privilege. And again, doesn't make me a brat, doesn't mean I'm have an advantage that I shouldn't have. It just means recognizing a privilege that I have that makes my life easier in some ways. I don't have to think about it, but when I do, I notice that there is privilege. As I'm plotting these for myself, I'd like you to think about where you might plot your own identity on these different words are getting to be really challenging right now. Narrative is kind of collapsing around me. So these ellipses, I lost that word and I found it again. So we're going to continue on. I'm going to move to sexual orientation. And you'll see again, I have plotted sexual orientation way at the edge of the diagram. I never have to think about that at all. I got married in 1985, a long time ago, almost 35 years ago. Nobody fussed about baking a cake for us or making our flowers or whether or not it was legal for us to get married. I can hold my husband's hand when we walk down the street and I don't have to worry that somebody's going to say something ugly or throw something at us. These are things that people who are queer do often have to think about and deal with. So for me, sexual orientation, again, is way on the outside of salience. I don't have to think about it. I do think about it, again, when it comes to my understanding of privilege and my willingness to think about things I don't have to think about. I recognize that my sexual orientation is not something that is terribly salient to me in a day-to-day way. And because I have that privilege, I want to work with and on behalf of those who don't have that privilege. So the next one would be class. And right now things are a little strange, and I know they are for a lot of people, so class becomes a little muddled right now. If you've just lost your job, and so you don't know exactly when you're going to have a job or be able to pay your bills, all of a sudden class becomes a whole lot more salient, more relevant. For me, I put class, there we go, sort of halfway, once again, to my core. It is something I have to think about. It's something I have to consider on a daily basis. There's a difference between being broke and being poor. Sometimes we're broke. I still have student loan debt, like a lot of people. We have a mortgage. So sometimes we are kind of close to the edge, like a lot of people. So sometimes class is complicated for me. But I have class privilege as well, because I know that if the difference between being broke and being poor, if I really have an issue, I can get some help because I've got resources, people who are willing to help me if I need it. That's very different from dealing with poverty. So while class is complicated, particularly in a time of COVID-19, for me, it is not, again, not one of those things I have to fight for or defend. It's not terribly close to my core. All right. The next one is religion. And here again, even as a chaplain, religion as an identity is not terribly salient to me. It's all the way, again, at the edge. It's not because it's not important to me. It's because it's something I don't have to think about. It's not relevant. It's, again, not something I have to defend. So when I think about religion, I think about the fact that I'm Christian. I'm United Methodist. I'm fairly common in the United States. I never have to explain Christmas or Easter to people. People understand what those holidays are. If I were Muslim and wanting to have an afternoon or a day off or miss an exam because of Eid, most likely I would have to explain that, and that would be very salient to me, to have to explain this part of my identity that's very important to me that other people may not understand. So although my Christianity is important to me, it is not salient in terms of having to explain or describe who I am to the general culture, because people understand Christianity. It's part of our culture. We have Sundays off. Christmas off. Holidays are generally understood. People know the narrative about Jesus in ways that we don't know the narrative about Buddha or Muhammad or other religious traditions. So although it's very important to me, it is not one of those things that's very salient. It's not something I have to defend. And finally, disability. Now, if I were in a wheelchair or needed other assistive mobility devices, if I needed a walker or crutches, disability would be very obvious. Disability is one of those things that's part of identity that may not be seen, but may still be very salient to people. I found out in December that I have a medical problem, a congenital problem that is causing some difficulties for me. And so although it is not salient in a way that I have to defend it, it is salient in that I have this this weird problem that sometimes people don't understand, and I have to explain it. So again, I'm going to place my understanding of my disability as being, I have to figure out how to move this, as being fairly close to my core. People with mental illness may not show, but those mental illnesses, particularly at times when they flare up, can be very salient. How do you explain to somebody that you have bipolar disorder or depression or some other issue that is quite difficult to manage? Other kinds of disabilities that are clear, I talk about a friend of mine who is in a wheelchair after being in a bike accident when he was in his 20s. He's a paraplegic. So it's very clear to people that he has a disability because he uses a wheelchair as accommodation for mobility. But in all the other capacities for identity that we're talking about today, he's white, he's Christian, he's straight, he's middle class. None of those things become terribly salient for him. But because that wheelchair makes it very clear that he has the disability, it is much more salient to him in having an effect on all of those places where he has privilege. So sometimes people in a wheelchair will experience people talking to them in a way that is infantilizing or not being aware of the skills and abilities they have, only focusing on the things that they are not able to do. Those kinds of things make a disability feel much more salient. So, as John Green said, I hope you watched that video, we contain multitudes. My identity, and this is only 6 of the kind of social identities that we're talking about today. You could add to this. When I've asked people in classes or in this workshop before to identify other ways that we might include other ellipses in this model, they might talk about ethnicity as being important, or body weight as being significant, people who have thin privilege. Other people talk about geography and where they come from, that people who are from some places are taken more seriously than people who are from other places. And you can kind of understand where that might be true. So you might add to this, but I would like you to take a minute to think about where you would place each of these identity markers on your own MMDI. How would you trace your own identity? And here's the other thing. It depends on where we are, right? I'm in my house right now. None of these are terribly salient. I'm living with my husband and my son, and we're kind of going about the way we do things, and it's day to day, and I don't really have to think about identity much at all. In normal times, when we're walking around in the world and being with other people, these are going to change depending on where I am. The example that I like to use is a student I worked with a few years ago who graduated from Otterbein, who was born in Africa, and she was from Gambia. And so when she's home in Gambia, her identity as an African American woman doesn't make much sense, because the majority of people there are Black and have the same kinds of experiences of being Black. When she is in the United States, that identity becomes much more salient to her, something that she has to navigate, something she has to think about. So be aware that place may change the way you experience these things. But if you take anything away from this diagram, take away the understanding that identity is complex, that it changes from place to place, it changes from year to year, how we understand ourselves. And if this is how I understand myself, and I have to think about how I plot things on this, just imagine trying to understand or interact with people you don't know, because you don't know how they would identify themselves on this kind of a complex understanding of identity. So sometimes we forget that while we contain multitudes, we forget that other people also contain multitudes. And this brings me to a very important part of this diagram. I'm so glad I cheated and drew this diagram ahead of time. It looks so much better than it does on a blackboard when I'm doing this in the workshop. So finally, there's a big circle now around all of the other ellipses and around that core. And this big circle on the outside of this diagram is context. So you can think of the context in which we live right now. The place we're getting our information, social media, any kind of media, print media, the news, the movies we watch, the television shows that inform what is normal or what is not normal in our culture. Big institutions like educational institutions and our government, those kinds of things provide context to how we understand ourselves. So I'm going to add that cultural context is so large and so vast and so much a part of our day-to-day lives that we don't always see it or pay attention to it as having an impact on how we live out our lives. Unfortunately, this context often leads us to stereotype. Remember at the beginning of this session when I asked you to have your first thoughts about different kinds of people that I described. Sometimes those first thoughts are driven by this cultural context. So if you think of the 22-year-old black man wearing blue jeans and a gray hoodie, depends on the context, but the news often portrays black folks in a much different way than they do white folks when there is an arrest. I remember a year ago there was a man who killed his family in Colorado, and every time the news had a picture of him, they showed a picture with his wife and his 2 daughters who he murdered. It was like a church photograph from a membership book. It was a portrait. And then there was another man who killed an intruder who was attacking his 2-year-old, and they always showed him in his orange jumpsuit. He was black. So I'm not saying that media is doing this deliberately. It's because of this great context that our minds are asked to think of black people as more animalistic, as dangerous, as a threat, while we're taught that white men are safe and intelligent and capable and that we should trust them. So the context sometimes will shape the way we experience people without thinking about it. This is called implicit bias. Everybody has implicit bias. Everybody has implicit bias. It's not something you can decide that you're going to take off. What you can do is start paying attention to those first thoughts that you have when you are trying to when you meet somebody for the very first time. What are your first thoughts? If you can take half a second to say, my first thought is being informed by context, by the media, by the way I understand people, rather than from actually knowing who this person is, it can make you a better citizen, a better person to interact with. That's good for you in school and in work situations eventually. So, but that is often the root of our stereotypes come from the context. Think about how Latinx folks are portrayed in a movie or a television show. Excuse me. Think about how people who are, think about how women are portrayed. Look at advertisements. How are women expected to look? How are men expected to behave? A lot of these come from our context. This is also something called social construction. We have socially constructed ideas about how people should behave and who they should be based on some of these different markers of identity. Social construction is something for you to look up. It's very important. It really does change the way we interact with one another. And I'll give you an example that I often share about when women are 6 or 7 months pregnant. Often they'll have a party and they'll pop a balloon or shoot off a cannon. That doesn't always work well. Or cut open a cake. And if there are pink M&Ms in the cake, then they know that the baby is a girl, right? All of the things about being a girl are imposed on that baby several months before she's born. We go to the pink aisle to buy lace dresses and dolls, and we think about her as being passive. If the cake is cut open and there are blue M&Ms inside, then all of a sudden it's footballs, and the clothes portray things that are very active. Again, before the child is born, these are sort of imposed or assumed about baby girls or baby boys, when in fact, those are socially constructed. They're not real. We don't have to look a certain way, act a certain way, or have these gender assignments in a way that's imposed by our culture. Because of the stereotypes, often there are issues of microaggression. I know some people find that term troubling, and I've heard some people have some resistance to it. What I would ask you to do is think about when people have made an offhand comment to you that wasn't necessarily intended to be rude, but may have come across that way. Excuse me. It's very dry in my house right now. What I would like for you to do now is look up, and I'm going to try to embed it in this video. If it doesn't show up in the video in a minute, go ahead and look up on YouTube microaggressions like mosquito bites. It's a very short little video, and I'd like you to watch that because it provides a good example of microaggressions and their effect, particularly the cumulative effect that microaggression may have on those people who experience them very often every day. All right, so once again, we think about how microaggression works. And the definition of a microaggression is unintended comments that undermine your sense of being part of being an insider. Sometimes we draw circles and we have an us and a them, and microaggressions sort of push people out into the outside of us, into them. So when you hear microaggressions, if you're one of those people who's always on the inside of that circle, it may feel like it's not that big a deal. But unless you experience it the way people do who are often minoritized, marginalized, push outside that circle, you're going to have a very different understanding of that. The stereotypes about angry black women or angry black men often comes from the fact that white folks don't have to deal with those kinds of microaggressions. So it feels like when we see people who get angry about having to deal with them all the time, that there's an overreaction. That was demonstrated in the video. Try to understand that just because you don't experience it doesn't mean that it isn't experienced as very real by the other person. There's another video that you can look up. I don't know if I'm going to try to embed it in this workshop or not, but it's called What Kind of Asian Are You? And it also demonstrates microaggression and kind of makes it very clear that we carry a lot of stereotyping thoughts in our heads when we're interacting with people, and sometimes we're just curious, but it still becomes very tiresome. So I want to talk a little bit about the difference between impact and intention. I just about every African-American woman that I've worked with at Otterbein has told me that somebody has come up and touched her hair without being asked if that's okay, but just sort of people go up and touch their hair. I've also heard from many, many African-American women that they've been told, "You're really pretty for a black girl." Those are microaggressive experiences, and they happen a lot. The intent might be benign. I'm curious about the texture of your hair because it's different than mine. When somebody says, "You're pretty for a black girl," they may mean that as a compliment. My idea of beauty is based on white women and a particular way of being female, and you're really pretty. But the way it comes across is, "You're pretty, but," or "I'm invading your space by touching your hair without your permission," which makes you feel perhaps like the boundaries don't exist for you. Oh, sorry. So that's a difference between impact and intent. If I say something that is hurtful, the best response for me is to say, oh, I'm sorry. I didn't intend to do that. But often in these kinds of exchanges, our intent is benign, and so therefore we get irritated if somebody else is hurt by that. So the analogy I often use is I'm standing in line next to somebody in the grocery store and I step on their foot. The thing I'm going to say is, I'm so sorry I stepped on your foot. Not, well, why were you standing there? Didn't you see me? You should have moved. That's ignoring the impact of my behavior or my what I have done. So I encourage you to explore the difference between your intent, which may be benign, and your impact, which may be painful or hurtful. Always remember that the way people experience things is shaped by this complexity of identity. People who carry around minoritized parts of their identity that are feeling often like they have to defend those are going to have different experiences of impact than somebody whose different dimensions of identity are not terribly salient. Remember, I said privilege is the stuff you never have to think about. I don't have to think about whether or not I'm going to be followed in a Macy's, or if the police pull me over, if they're pulling me over because I did something wrong or because of the color of my skin. Excuse me. If I am Christian, I don't have to wonder about the impact of, or I don't have to worry about somebody else's questions about my religion, because they're not assuming somehow that I'm a terrorist because of my religion. Whereas if I were a hijabi, if I were a woman, a Muslim woman wearing a hijab or a niqab, perhaps I would have to feel often like I need to defend these parts of my identity because they're often misunderstood by the larger culture. Remember, that context becomes very important. So we're going back to the very beginning about all of this, why it's important for you to understand. I teach an SYE at Otterbein that deals with engaging with difference. What we have found in many, many disciplines, lots and lots of different studies, is that employers are looking for people who are able to work with those who are different in ways that are successful. What we're finding is that diverse teams are more innovative, more creative, more able to achieve higher standards of productivity. I would record this again, but I really don't want to, so I apologize for my coughing. Difference is not deficient, and often we've been taught to be a little wary of differences, so that when we come to a place like Otterbein, which is still a predominantly white institution, but is much more diverse than some people's high schools or hometowns, that we learn how to engage with difference in a way that's respectful, curious and inquisitive without being hurtful. These are things that keep us from being jerks. So I do invite you to think about all of these different things. I like to talk about this as thank you, honey. As roller skating through an art museum. So we have touched on a lot of different issues. The MMDI, which again is by Jones and Abes. The issues of stereotypes, microaggression, privilege. We've just waltzed through a museum without really having time to unpack all of that. So I encourage you, if you have questions, reach out. I'm happy to have a Zoom meeting with any of you. I'm getting really good at that one. to talk further about any of these issues if you're curious, particularly if there are things that you don't know about, especially anti-racism or being supportive of the LGBTQIA plus folks in our communities, particularly trans folk in our communities. If you have questions about any of those things, please reach out. Give me some feedback. I know this was a little rough. We'll see how the editing goes. Thank you very much. Take care.